Okay, welcome back to another Between the Pages book chat here. And hope you all had a happy holiday. I know I did. And today's guest is Chris Lodwig, and we're here to talk about book two in his systemic series, and that's called Host.
hmm
And if longtime viewers of the show will remember that we did interview him back for his first book. So this is his second appearance. And now I'm going to turn it over to him and let him introduce himself. So take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me back. I really appreciate being back on your show. So my name is Chris Lodwig, and I try to think of something interesting about me. I live in Seattle. I write books. I've now written two. Both of these books are speculative fiction books. The first book in the series was called Systemic, and this one's called Host, and it is a series. So there's going to be some spoilers about Systemic, so I apologize. But I think in order to talk about Host, I need to to give you some spoilers. Systemic was all about a global AI that was running the planet, a benevolent AI, but an AI nonetheless, that was trying to keep society together and make sure everything was copacetic. Without giving too much of that book away, that AI dies at the end of the book, and before leaving humanity to their own devices, it sort of deposits a very large tome, sort of an instruction manual for how to run society in its absence. Because, as I said, it's a benevolent AI, and it knows once it's gone, and it knows it's going away. It wants the humanity to be able to, take up the challenge when it's gone. So that's how Systemic ends. And Host is the book that picks up after that, about 300 years later, and after the collapse of society. The question that is going through the book is, you have there's two of them, two large books of instructions on how to run a society. Who would have those books, and what would they do with them, is sort of where the book starts off. And so the setting for it is that there are professors, they're called professors in the book, who are itinerant professors, and they tour around a circuit of small towns that are near the population center where their university is, and they just kind of teach people the lessons from the book. They're sort of almost like preachers, and so that's the setting of the book. And I will leave it there and see if there's other questions.
Okay, so it sounds almost like the books and the professors, they're sort of like a new form of religion almost, or
That Yeah,
kind
I
of
mean,
a,
in a way. That's not coincidental. I did want to have, it's a little bit analogous to religions, and there was definitely part of that. And there's a lot of religious iconography and a lot of religious metaphor running through the book. But I did want it to be secular, because I didn't want it to be really about religion as such. It's not really about spirituality as such, but it does have to do a lot with the founding of ideas and schools of thought, whether it's religious, whether it's educational, whether it's society. What are those things that the myths of our societies, the founding documents of our societies, and as those make their way up through history, how do the people who interpret those things and their agendas and their personalities and everything that has to do with them being human, how are those original documents filtered up through that, and how does that impact the society? So that was kind of what I was going for, and it can derive religious meaning from that.
yeah. There's a lot of I would think a lot of historic context in that too, because historic documents have been reinterpreted and misinterpreted across the centuries as well. So
Yeah, those are all things that were on my mind when I was writing the book, so yes.
okay, so when you wrote this book, did you originally intend it to be a series, or just did this book come out of this first one?
Well, it's funny. When I first started writing Systemic, I didn't even know I was writing a book. I started, I hadn't written in many, many years. And so I just one day on the bus, I just started writing because I was bored. My computer and my phone died. And so I started writing by hand and I wrote a scene and I'm like, this is fun. And I really was just really enjoying writing for the first time in about 15 years. And 9 months later, I had a sci-fi book on my hands, and I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And so I wrote that book. And right at the end of Systemic, I'm like, "Oh, what would the epilogue be to this book after it ends?" And I wrote one, and my editor said, "Yeah, that's totally disjointed. You can't really have that at the end of this book." And I said, "Okay, well, I guess I have to write another book to cover off of that little epilogue." And so I started that with my next book, and my next editor said, "This doesn't really belong in this book. You need this whole other book in the middle." And I said, "Okay." So now I finally moved that first epilogue from Systemic is now the beginning of book three, and that's where it belongs, and so I'm going to keep it. So in short, I didn't really expect to write a novel, um, but after I was done with Systemic, I pretty much knew that I had a series on my hands.
That sounds like an interesting one too. So, um, just a sec. My train of thought just died here. Oh, okay, okay. Tell us about the main character. Um,
Uh,
uh, what's she like?
okay, so the main character, speaking of things that I didn't really intend, um, when I started writing Host, I had in mind that really it was going to be a continuation of the main characters from Systemic. In particular, the character Lem, who is the male protagonist of that story, and Aaron, who's the female protagonist of that story. And I wanted it to be about them after the fall of the system and all that. And it pretty quickly became about this other person named Rayan. Her full name is Rayan Kaya, and she's a kind of she's a neurodivergent child who's got some serious social problems. Doesn't really fit in, isn't very well liked, but she is, unbeknownst to her and everyone around her, quite brilliant. In fact, a lot of the problems that she has are due to her intelligence and her ability, though it feels more like a curse than an ability, but the amount of information that she can take in uh, at one time is it's overwhelming to her. And because she's odd and awkward, she's very uh, unpopular in her small town where she is, where she was been born and raised. And what happens to her very early in the story is that these itinerant professors come into her town, and again, without giving too much away, she winds up kind of joining the circus and going off with them. And her arc as a character has to do with her figuring out that this whole, instead of the digital system that existed as an AI, the books have turned into sort of a social system, getting back to kind of the ideas of religion. There's a system that they've built of values and behaviors and things, and that they teach. That's now the system. It's about her figuring out the way that her unique mind and the way that she processes information can benefit that system. And so that's the arc of her story. And she meets a couple friends along the way, and that's how it works.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about some of the friends, the secondary characters.
Okay. The first one, uh, some of the secondary characters, there's two professors, one named Par, one called Sev, and they're the professors that take her in. There's a novice professor who really becomes one of her very best friends. His name is Kavi Har, or Kavi, and he's again a novice professor, so he's learning how to become a professor. And then there is a friend that she makes on her way to the big city, one of the stopovers, and her name is Avelina. And they're that's kind of the cast of characters. The Sev is again one of the chief professors. He is sort of, I think of him as sort of a Snape-like character. He kind of comes off as a little bit bristly and prickly, and but he signs up to be her mentor. And then there's another one named Par, and Par is the strong, quiet, thoughtful one who's that. So those are kind of her two mentors: the sort of bristly, prickly one, and the sort of calm, thoughtful one. Kavian Har is, I wouldn't say he's a rebel in the traditional sense of the word. He's not, so I don't know, fighting against society or anything like that. But he does have one thing going for him that makes him a bit rebellious inherently, which is that he really likes technology. Everything's broken, and it's sort of a post-apocalyptic world sort of thing that they're in, and everything's broken. And the professors have taken it as a part of their philosophy that all that old tech was bad. The system, we had all this AI a couple hundred years ago, it let us down. Technology's bad. And he has an inherent interest in all things technical. And that kind of puts him a little bit at odds with society. And so him and Ran Kaya become very good friends, and it's a lot of it has to do with their journey together.
Okay, so the society, does it have any tech at all, or is it kind of gone back to a more agricultural, rural sort of a society?
Let me think how to put this without giving too much away. There's more than you might think, but they would have you think that there is none. So a lot of what this story and the power structure, it's a lot of the book is about the power structures that grow out of people who have information versus people who do not have information, and whatever their motivations are, how that winds up manifesting itself in culture and society. And so because they cannot manufacture new tech, they have lost all ability to do those things. Society has very much regressed back to an agricultural state of affairs. When the system left the book, in its mind, it had in mind that you should be able to rebuild a society, but since they were incapable of doing so, rather than work and work and work and try to fix it, they just said, "Oh, that's just all bad, and we don't really want it." And so it became sort of anathema. So the reason that there's no tech isn't because people are stupid and they can't figure things out. It's that culturally they've decided that they don't like it, because they think that those were the bad old times, and if we go down the path of technology, it's just going to lead us right back to the bad old times, and that's why society is the way that it is.
Sort of like a opposite reaction to a lot of people who go nostalgic about past years today.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. I like that.
Yeah.
So, what was the hardest scene that you wrote in the book, or the hardest type of scene?
That's a really good question. You know, the hardest scenes for me tend to be strangely the easiest scenes to write. And what I mean by that is I will find a scene that's really great and it just flows out of my brain. I'm like, oh, that was so easy and so wonderful, and I love it. And then my editor will look at it and go, well, that's a bunch of garbage and you need to get rid of it or fix it or do whatever. And so I find that the hardest scenes I have are the ones that were simplest for me to write. Originally, the first draft, I'm like, it just flowed so beautifully and so well. And I have to, especially if I want to keep that scene, it had some sort of core of meaning or something in it that was good. I have to just work at it and work at it and work at it and showing it to my wife and showing it to my editor and refining it. I'll iterate on those scenes forever. And so they become, on balance, the ones that I spend the most time and energy working through. There was one in particular that I wrote very, very early on, which was a graduation scene, because these are professors and they're graduating. There's all this stuff going on. And I really liked it because it was a great world building scene and it had all this details and all that. And, everyone's like, this is really boring. No one cares. No one really wants to sit here. And I'm like, but it has these things in it. And I took it from, this log down to this log, down to this log. And that scene in particular was very, very hard for me to get to a place where I liked it still. And my editor let me keep it. So.
Yeah, the world building can kill you sometimes.
It's like, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that I had. I wrote this novel, and when first off, it was supposed to be this novel and the next novel. That was the arc of the story, and it was huge. And at some point, I'm like, I've already written like 400,000 words, and I'm like, that's not going to work. So I had to cut that in half, and I found a good breaking point, and I know what the breaking point is. And so now I'm like, now I've got 3 books. But even after I did that, and I handed my rough draft to my editor, from that moment until it was published, I removed 84,000 words from it. So I basically edited a novel out of my novel. So there was a lot of stuff that I pulled out of this book, and it was arduous.
Okay, so what was your favorite scene or type of scene that you wrote in this book?
The Another very good question. I always like the scenes that I can't talk about because they're surprise scenes, but those are the ones I love because when I write them, I don't know that they're going to happen, and they take me by surprise. There was a great evidence of that in Systemic. There was a moment like that I literally did not know was going to happen a paragraph before I wrote it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so much fun, and where I get all jazzed about it. That's really fun. And there was another moment in this book that was like that as well. That obviously I can't talk about, gives something away, but it's gleeful to write something like that. I also mentioned earlier that I didn't know this book was really about Kaya and her friends, and there was one scene. People who have read the book might recognize the scene where she's at this town. Her and the caravan of professors have stopped for the night in this town, and she's having dinner. And there's just some banter amongst 13 to 16-year-old kids. They're sitting around at the kids' table at a big banquet talking, and she's kind of shy and she doesn't really want to talk to them and all that. But you get to hear the kids all picking on each other, and it was really, really fun. And that was the moment when I decided the book was actually about her, because I just loved writing that scene so much. And I just instantly focused on her as a character in my rough draft. And there is another scene that's very similar where she's at lunch with a bunch of Kavi's friends, and they're punching each other. There's a game you do where you have to do this kind of thing. And if people see it's a boy thing. We always did it when we were kids. And if you see the thing and you don't break it, then you get to punch somebody, and the boys just like punching each other at table. And it was just really, really fun to write, just because it reminded me so much of my childhood and what boys are like when we're a bunch of idiots punching each other in the arms. And it was just very enjoyable to write. Yeah, it was fun.
Okay, so what are your characters afraid of?
Well, you have very good questions. So let's start. I did it in order. Some of these things I can't tell you, but one I will. So Sev, that particular professor, is scared of. He's somebody who is trying to keep society together. He really wants everything to work. There's a system, no pun intended. There's a system of things, and there's a structure to things. And if you stray from that too far, society will fall apart. That's his biggest fear. And everything he does is motivated by that underlying fear. Parr is afraid. That's the other professor. He's afraid of stagnation. He's afraid the opposite way, that society isn't moving forward, and that he's not fulfilling his role as a professor to move society forward. So that's his fear. Rayon is just afraid of being lonely. She has spent her whole life being abandoned. Her whole life has been being rejected by other kids, and she just doesn't want to be alone. She just wants to fit in somewhere, and she thinks she's a freak. She thinks she's terrible, and she thinks she's really stupid, even though she very much isn't. And so it's all about social rejection for her. Kavi's a little bit afraid of growing up. He's afraid of what happens when he becomes a professor, because he's a novice and he's going to do that. And he knows that becoming a professor changes you in a very fundamental way. And that makes him nervous.
Okay, so you obviously write sci-fi. Have you tried any other genres, or are there any other genres you'd like to try?
Yeah, it's funny. I do write sci-fi, but I don't do it on purpose. When I wrote Systemic, for the first 90 pages, I didn't even know I was writing a sci-fi novel. And the reason it became a sci-fi novel was because there was a lot of things that I was interested in exploring around perception and around sort of personality and memory and things like that. And so the sci-fi was really there to help me explore those concepts. Uh, I do like sci-fi quite a bit. It's one of my favorite things to read. So and when you get into Host, it's speculative fiction. There's not a lot of sci because all the science is broken, right? And so it still is speculative fiction, and there's a little bit of sci-fi in there, elements here and there, but not very many. Um, the next book I'm going to write, the one I'm currently working on, which I think is going to be called Rhizomatic, has a lot of sci-fi elements in it, and a lot of almost verging on fantasy elements on it, where there's this blending of nature and technology and all these sorts of things. It's going to be kind of wacky, and I'm starting to write that, and it's really, really fun. And so I think that the fantasy genre is also something that I dabble in, and probably just sort of literary fiction. I would write some too, just sort of emotional landscapes and things like that. Um, but those are, I don't do historical fiction, not because I don't like history, but because I'm really lazy and I don't want to do a bunch of research. When my friend says, "Hey, is there sage in Iceland, or is there sage growing in Iceland?" I'm like, "Oh, you would have to look that up, wouldn't you?" And about 300 other things as well. So
Yeah, I can understand that writing historical fantasy.
yeah.
Yeah, you fall down the research rabbit holes really
Yeah, yeah.
far.
I like to write fast. I want to write fast. So I have to stop and research.
Yeah,
I still do a fair amount of little research, like what is the name of this part of a horse? I still got to look that up, but that's a Google search. It
yeah.
takes 20 seconds, and
Yeah,
uh,
I once spent an hour trying to research the difference between doorknobs and door handles in Victorian England. So,
yeah,
yeah, I understand your reluctance.
yeah, exactly. And it's funny because there are people out there that just sit there, they lie in wait, and as soon as you get something wrong, they pounce on you. Um, And I even have some beta readers. One of my very, very good friends was one of my beta readers, and she is really into textiles. And the amount that she dragged me over the coals around inaccuracies around textiles and what would or wouldn't be in existence in this part of the world, and she just went all off. And I'm like, okay, and I just took notes and fixed everything and all that. And so it's fun. Do your
Okay.
beta readers do that too? Do you ever have? First off, do you use beta readers?
Yeah, I do, but I love research, so they
Yeah,
probably don't find a lot of the inaccuracies because
yeah,
I have to know. Okay,
yeah.
I'm one of the readers who would pick it apart, actually.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, I did figure out something though about beta readers, which I think is very funny. And I didn't know this when I wrote my first book, and the first people read it, and they started saying things like, "What type of trees are around here?" And I'm like, "Oh, I best guess I better go answer that because people want to know." And every beta reader that comes to your book brings this whole world of things that they want to know, and they're all different, and I just find that very funny. My editor was very into gardening, and she kept asking me questions about gardens and things, and what are the gardens like there in this system, and what do they use for fertilizer? And I'm like, I don't know if that's really all that important to the story, but that's what she's into. So I got a lot of gardening accuracy and a lot of textile accuracy thanks to my beta readers and editor. So
Well, you never know. It may come in handy someday.
I hope so.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up there on that note, and I'll let you tell everyone where they can find you and your books.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much for the interview. That was a lot of fun. So you can find me the books you can get just about anywhere. They're on Barnes and Noble. They're on Amazon. The audio book of Systemic is on Audible.com, and I think it's on iTunes Books, I believe, as well. So you can find Systemic pretty much anywhere. Um, they're published through Amazon, and they distribute from Amazon. Host, I don't have an audiobook yet. I should be kicking off my audiobook in just a couple days with my narrator, Dave Cruz. We'll start working on that. But you can get the ebook, you can get the paperbacks on Amazon, and you can look me up. ChrisLodwigAuthor.com is my website. You can find me at Chris Lodwig Author on Facebook. and Instagram. I think it's just Chris Lodwig. There's not a lot of Chris Lodwigs in the world, so I'm pretty easy to find.
Okay, and I have the book and the series and the website linked down below in the description if anyone
Wonderful.
wants to check them out. So, and thank you for being our guest. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
It was a pleasure chatting with you. So thank you so much.
And between the pages, we'll be back next weekend with another author. So join us then. And that's all for now. So,
Okay.
bye.
Bye bye.